Hello, Spring Lake Village. This is Nick again. I'm back. And this week we're going to be wrapping up our four-part lecture series on the women's suffrage movement. And you'll recall last week we saw that the disparate women's organizations had merged together to create a united front with the establishment of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in February of 1890. You'll recall that it had been created by the merger of two existing organizations, NWSA, or the National Women's Suffrage Association, and the AWSA, or the American Women's Suffrage Association. Its membership was about 7,000 at the time it was formed, but eventually its numbers would swell to over 2 million, making it the largest voluntary organization in the nation's history. So we also saw how Susan B. Anthony, a longtime leader in the suffrage movement, became the dominant figure in the newly formed NAWSA, and after her presidency, Carrie Chapman Catt would assume that position in 1900, and Catt would implement a strategy of recruiting wealthy members of the rapidly growing women's club movement, whose time, money, and experience would help build the suffrage movement. At the dawn of the 20th century, the NAWSA went through a major overhaul. Instead of focusing on passage of suffrage referenda in various states, there was a major thrust now to organize and push for the ratification of enough state suffrage amendments to force Congress to approve a federal amendment. But some of the radical factions continue to address corollary issues, but the new approach now would focus the group's energies exclusively on recruiting new members and winning the vote for women. And it changed its tactics. It recruited a number of high society women and celebrities, and as a result, a lot of money was generated that in turn was used to enlist a whole new generation of women who would go out and canvass for votes, educate women, educate politicians, etc. There were many newsreels that showcased the rallies and parades now that were held throughout the country. Women suffragists wore white, symbol of purity. These were the crusaders of a new generation of women calling for women, unite now. Now is the time to push and force Congress to pass an amendment that would at long last allow us to vote. This new generation of women, the second wave of suffragettes, were educated, very spirited, very vocal, somewhat akin to many of the educated women we see in the Black Lives Matter parades, who are very vocal, etc. The most famous leader of this new generation was Alice Paul, who came from a very prominent and progressive Quaker family in New Jersey. Paul's parents had embraced gender equality, education for women, and had worked very tirelessly to advance women's causes. Paul's mother, herself a suffragist, had brought Alice with her to many women's suffrage meetings. Alice was one of the most educated women of her generation. In 1905, she earned her biology degree from Swarthmore College, a Quaker school that had been co-founded by her grandfather. She then attended Columbia University, where she earned her master's degree. And as we shall see, she later received a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. In 1907, we find young Alice in England, where she met the most famous suffragists of that time, the Pankhursts, Mother Emmeline and her spirited daughters, Christabel and Sylvia. And through the Pankhursts, Alice Paul learned some of the more militant tactics that were being employed, including hunger strikes and marching on Parliament, and that sort of get in your face tactic, which was so effective in bringing about suffrage in the UK. While in England, Alice met American Lucy Burns, who also learned many of the militant protest tactics, including picketing and hunger strikes. They both returned to the United States, and in 1912, I mentioned that Alice went on to earn her doctorate in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. In 1912, Alice and Lucy joined the NAWSA, with Alice leading the Washington, D.C. chapter. NASA primarily focused on state-by-state campaigns, but Paul preferred to lobby Congress for a constitutional amendment. Such differences led Alice and others to split with the NAWSA and form the National Women's Party. Alice played a major role in resuscitating the US suffrage movement. She was a superb organizer and a very inspirational leader. Borrowing from her British counterparts, Alice relentlessly browbeat politicians. She was known to really make life miserable for them in achieving her goal. But she was not fond of using violent tactics, burning buildings, desecrating monuments, etc. These were some of the more extreme tactics that the Pankhursts and their cohorts employed. She, as a Quaker, did not believe in those more belligerent tactics. Alice was absolutely brilliant in organizing parades and pickets in support of suffrage. She was extraordinarily talented, a great educator, a spirited public speaker, and she really very much inspired women from across the spectrum. So she dazzled not only the more militant members of the suffragist movement, but many of the more conservative elements as well. In early 1913, Alice and Lucy sought to revive the NAWSA. And so they established the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, whose purpose was to lobby Congress to introduce the suffrage amendment. Initially, they had support, but later there was a lot of divisiveness among the more senior members. Nonetheless, Alice pushed forward with the help of her new congressional union, and she organized what has gone down as the most famous women's march in US history, and that was the famous Women's March on Washington, D.C., which was held on the 3rd of March in 1913, on the eve of President-elect Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. More than 8,000 suffragists marched down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol building to Washington, to the White House. There were marching bands, banners, squadrons, chariots, and floats displayed in the parade representing all women's lives. Perhaps the most notable sight was a huge banner which declared, "We demand an amendment to the US Constitution enfranchising the women of the country." Unfortunately, some Black and women's organizations wanted the parade to be segregated. And so some of the most famous Black suffragists were forced to march in sort of a separate side parade. Poor Woodrow Wilson, when he arrived at Union Station on the eve of his inauguration, there were very few people there to greet him. Everybody was off at the festive goings-on up on Pennsylvania Avenue. This famous parade garnered a lot of notoriety and attention to the suffrage movement. But unfortunately, it was marked by quite a bit of violence. Over 500,000 people came to view the parade, and with insufficient police there to protect the crowd, the situation devolved into a near riot, with many onlookers pressing so close to the women that they were unable to proceed. Police largely did nothing to protect the women from rioters and some of the more violent spectators. A senator who participated in the march would later testify that he personally took the badge number of 22 officers who had stood idly by. Fortunately, some members of the National Guard stepped in, as well as some students from a local college who provided a human barrier to help the women continue to march down Pennsylvania Avenue. Some accounts even describe Boy Scouts who stepped in and provided first aid to some injured women. The incident mobilized public dialogue about the police response to the women's demonstration, producing greater awareness and quite a bit of sympathy for the NAWSA. So the parade was extremely successful in gaining publicity for the movement, and as a result of a lot of the violence that women suffered during the march, they earned a lot of sympathy from the public. The Congressional Union was very successful in gathering over 200,000 signatures. And after this major event, NASA would focus specifically on lobbying Congress for a constitutional amendment to secure the right to vote for women. Show you a few photos of the Women's March on Washington, D.C. on the 3rd of March, 1913. This is an image of the goddess Athena. Actually, Athena is a war goddess, Athena Promachos, leading her troops into battle. Here you see a number of women marching and riding horses down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol. Leading the parade was the famous labor lawyer, Inez Mulholland. Here you see her all dressed in white and riding a white steed like a beautiful crusader. The New York Times described this as one of the most impressively beautiful spectacles ever staged in the United States. Paul's militant methods started to create some tension between her and the leaders of the NAWSA, who thought she was moving much too aggressively in Washington. We saw how this tension had led to a break with the NAWSA, with Paul forming the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. Although both Carrie Chapman Catt, the NAWSA president, and Alice had shared the goal of universal suffrage, their political strategies really could not have been more different or incompatible. Where the NAWSA had concentrated a majority of its efforts upon state campaigns, Paul wanted to focus all energy and funding upon a national amendment. Well, the NAWSA endorsed President Wilson in his re-election bid and looked to members of the Democratic Party as allies. Alice Paul wanted to hold Wilson and his party responsible for women's continued disenfranchisement. This emulated the British suffragette policy of holding the party in power responsible. Alice reorganized her congressional union into the National Women's Party in 1916. The National Women's Party began introducing some of the methods used by the suffrage movement in Great Britain and focused entirely on achieving a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. Ava Belmont, a multi-millionaire socialite at the time, was the largest donor to Alice's efforts. The NWP was accompanied by a lot of press coverage and the publication of their weekly newspaper called The Suffragist. In the US presidential election of 1916, Alice and the National Women's Party campaigned in Western states where women could already vote against the continuing refusal of President Wilson and other incumbent Democrats to actively support the suffrage amendment. A number of politicians in the 9 Western states where the NWP campaign claimed that these women had no impact on their campaigns, but nonetheless, half of them did lose in 1916. A women's suffrage amendment was introduced into Congress in 1916 for the first time in some 20 years. But the proposed amendment, called the Shafroth-Palmer Amendment, was in no way the Susan B. Anthony Amendment of 20 years earlier, which stated the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. This new amendment defines suffrage as a states' rights issue, and it was rejected by the suffragettes. In the spring of 1917, with America's entry into World War I, the great push to secure the vote for women was temporarily halted. Many suffragettes ceased their activism in an act of patriotic duty to support the war effort between 1917 and 1919. Women were absolutely crucial to the process of mobilization in defense of the United States, and in many ways their service would foreshadow their performance during the Second World War. Faced with a shortage of troops at the outset of war, President Wilson ordered a draft for all men between 21 and 30 years old. About 3 million were drafted, and by the end of the war, over 4 million had served in the Army. The millions of doughboys who had gone off to war obviously left gaping holes in American industry at a time when the country couldn't risk a hit to production. Left without much choice, some 9 million American women poured into the workforce. The change was certainly sudden and staggering, dissolving the lines that had once existed between where women did and didn't belong. In the theater of war, women performed brilliantly as ambulance drivers, as doctors, telephone operators, etc. Also as relief workers and support staff for the military. Back at home, we find women assuming jobs that normally were not open to them, especially in the factories, in the defense industry, in the railroad industry, in oil refineries, etc. During peacetime, 98% of the jobs in the railroad industry were held by men. But women who were present would work behind the scenes in jobs like cleaning or catering. But once the war began, almost half the railroad workers fighting age were recruited. And this meant that almost overnight, the railroads became a decidedly female operation. New jobs were also created because of the war, jobs that needed to be filled if the U.S. was to keep up with the pace of war. So, for example, Connecticut produced almost half of the country's ammunition during the war, and the number of women working in the factories in Connecticut increased by over 100% because of increased demand and, of course, a decreased number of men who are off fighting the war. A whopping 8 million women became Red Cross volunteers, doing everything from sewing surgical dressings to working in canteens. And amazingly, it wasn't just men who went off to war, but many women also saw combat. The Red Cross trained some 20,000 nurses to work in the U.S. Armed Forces. Other women worked for the Salvation Army, darting in and out of the front lines, offering donuts and coffee and helping to write letters home that would be sent back to loved ones. Women also were very instrumental in securing funds through the Liberty loan drives. Even librarians mobilized for war, building makeshift libraries in camps that would distribute some 10 million books and magazines to soldiers. In total, the number of American women who joined the war effort dwarfed the nearly 4 million men who served in the armed forces. But women's sudden entrance en masse into both the war and public life brought a central injustice of American life into sharp relief. Though they fought and died in the war, they still could not vote for it. This irony helped to crystallize the battle for the vote that suffragists have been fighting for nearly 70 years. The NAWSA believed that the war effort would help galvanize the feminist movement. After all, this patriotic performance on the part of women would have to pay dividends in their belief. Women had been told by President Wilson as a pretext to enter the war, the world must be made safe for democracy. But to many suffragists, wasn't this a slap in the face? It had been decades since the fight for the vote had kicked off at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1948. And while it's true that women had gotten the vote in several Western states, the national fight had stagnated, in part because Wilson himself opposed it, believing the decision should be left up to the individual states. Alice Paul's National Women's Party was most critical of the US government and Wilson's hypocrisy. Fighting for democracy overseas while women back at home were denied the right to vote? How could that be? But the more reserved Carrie Chapman Catt and her NAWSA didn't find the behavior of the NWP very ladylike, rather unseemly, and so they distanced themselves from the NWP. But the mainstream suffragist decision to focus on the nation's needs during a time of war would prove to help their cause. Let me show you a few images of women serving in the war effort. Here's a woman in a munitions factory. This is a photograph of women in a Red Cross parade. This is an image of nurses aboard a Navy boat en route to France. And here you see a female ambulance driver who is somewhere in France, not far from the Western Front. In January of 1917, just a few months before the United States entered World War I, the NWP would employ a new tactic, and that was staging a political protest and picketing the White House. Although today we regard picketing as a First Amendment right, as part of peaceful assembly, back in 1914, it was still not a legal act to picket. So in that year, 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act legalized picketing. So the women picketing in front of the White House were not doing anything illegal. The pickets who were participating in this nonviolent civil disobedience campaign were known as the Silent Sentinels. Alice Paul, the leader of the NWP, knew that the only way they could accomplish this goal was by displaying Wilson's attitude towards suffrage. So picketing would achieve that in the best possible way. Up to this point, Woodrow Wilson had been very dismissive of the suffragists. In a letter he wrote to his daughter, he said, "The suffragists seem bent on making their cause as obnoxious as possible." The Silent Sentinels wanted to publicly shame the president. One of their banners read, "Mr. President, how long must we women wait for liberty?" Another banner said, "We shall fight for the things which we have always laid nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the rights of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments." For his part, Wilson mostly ignored these women, dismissed them, but he could even be patronizing. At one point, he went out to the South Lawn and invited them up for coffee. "Come on, ladies, let's discuss this over a good cup of coffee." Although the suffragists protested peacefully, their protests were sometimes violently opposed. While they were protesting, some young men would harass and even beat them, with the police officers never intervening on behalf of the protesters. Police would even arrest other men who tried to help the women who were getting beaten. From June of 1917 until 1919, well over 200 women were arrested on charges of obstructing traffic. Many, including Alice Paul and other members of the NWP, were arrested and sent off to jails in Virginia and in the District of Columbia. Just as we saw with the suffragettes in Great Britain, many of the prison inmates were beaten by prison guards, thrown around, and even force-fed when they went on hunger strikes. Public sympathy turned in their favor when the news of the first arrests became known. Some were surprised that leading suffragists like Alice Paul and very well-connected women from high society were going to prison for simply peacefully protesting. Wilson received very bad publicity from this event and was absolutely livid with the position he was forced into. He did quickly pardon the first woman who was arrested on the 19th of July, 2 days after they had been sentenced. But reporting on the arrests and the abuses would continue. The Boston Journal, for example, stated, "This little band representing the NWP had been abused and bruised by government clerks, soldiers, and sailors until its efforts to attract the president's attention has sunk into the conscience of the whole nation." The Silent Sentinels would continue to picket outside the White House after the Wilson pardon and throughout World War I. And here's a photograph of Silent Sentinels and other women walking almost solemnly up the stairs of a federal building. So here we have an image of women demanding the release of Alice Paul and some other women who had been arrested on the flimsy charge of obstructing traffic. Paul herself was sentenced to jail for some 7 months, and in prison she organized a hunger strike in protest. Doctors threatened to send Paul to an insane asylum and even force-fed her, while newspaper accounts of her treatment garnered public sympathy and support for the suffrage movement. World War I, of course, had a profound impact on women's suffrage across the globe. Women had played a major role on the home fronts, and many countries would recognize their sacrifices with the vote during or shortly after the war. Women would get the right to vote in Canada in 1917, except for the province of Quebec, in Britain, Germany, and Poland in 1918, in Austria, Russia, and the Netherlands in 1919. Pressure for suffrage would increase dramatically in the United States. In 1917, in November, a referendum to give women the right to vote in New York, which at that time was the most populous state in the country, passed by a substantial margin. A reluctant Woodrow Wilson came on board very, very late in the game, but now the pressure mounted from his daughter Margaret, who was fully in support of the women's movement, and also because of the overwhelming passage of the referendum in New York. Wilson now was committed to the cause, and he would make a strong appeal in the House of Representatives when an amendment was brought to a vote. Wilson made a very strong and widely published appeal to the House of Representatives to pass a suffrage bill, and it was the National American Women's Suffrage Association and not the more extreme National Women's Party that was very decisive in Wilson's conversion to the cause of the federal amendment. The NAWSA's approach mirrored his own conservative vision of the appropriate method of reform. Namely, to win a broad consensus, develop a legitimate rationale, and make the issue politically valuable. The amendment passed by 2/3 of the House with only one vote to spare. The vote was then carried into the Senate, and again, we find Wilson making an appeal, but on the 30th of September in 1918, the amendment fell 2 votes short of the 2/3 necessary for passage. In February of 1919, the Senate defeated the amendment again by 1 vote, but 6 more state legislatures had granted women the vote by the time Wilson called Congress into a special session in May. Now, this time the measure carried in the House by a wide majority and passed the Senate on June 4th, 1919, on a 2-vote majority. Ratification of the amendment required another long struggle, and it came to pass quickly in states where suffrage organizations remained active, but the process dragged on into 1920. Finally, only 1 more state was needed, but most of the holdouts were in the South. The battle came to a head in August in Tennessee with relentless lobbying by both pro and anti-suffrage forces. There were various reports of threats, bribes, and drunken legislators. Tennessee's Senate passed the measure easily, but in the House, where there were numerous delays engineered by the opposition, the suffragists believed they lacked the last votes needed for the passage. In the end, a young Republican voted aye when his mother urged him to support the measure. Just 8 days after Tennessee narrowly ratified the 19th Amendment, it became the law of the land. The 19th Amendment reads, "The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." The 1920 election would become the first United States presidential election in which women were permitted to vote in every state. Politicians wanted the support of every female voter as possible, and so they placed great emphasis on issues that they believed would be very appealing to women at the time. Women, like their male counterparts, became very much involved in the political issues of the day and many of the referenda that were on the ballot. And interestingly, they follow the same behavior as their male counterparts in voting. The 19th Amendment was a huge victory for women, but it did not automatically guarantee women other political rights. These included the ability to serve on juries or running for office. And it also did not rectify many other discriminatory practices that were enshrined in various laws. So to address these many existing discriminatory practices that existed, Alice Ball and her NWP went ahead and introduced the Federal Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. The ERA languished for 50 years, but was reintroduced in the early 1970s, and then languished again, but there has been a renewed effort to push for its passage, and it nearly has the requisite 2/3 state legislatures that would assure its passage. To prepare women for their new civic responsibilities after the passage of the 19th Amendment, Carrie Chapman Catt converted the NAWSA into the League of Women Voters, the LWV. Of course, this is an organization that even today is dedicated to nonpartisan educational activity. Historians continue to examine the impact that the 19th Amendment had on the national level during the conservative decade of the 1920s. The historical record shows that women did not form a solid voting bloc, so the major political parties soon lost interest in cultivating their support, and few women were elected to office. And of course, there was a much more complicated dynamic going on at the state level, especially as regards African American women who were restricted from voting as a result of Jim Crow laws and violence for many decades until the Civil Rights era in the 1960s. So in the end, winning the vote did not guarantee all American women full equality, but it did recognize their fundamental right of self-representation, permanently changing the composition of our citizenry, and provided the necessary foundation for subsequent achievements. So next week, we'll begin an all-new lecture series on the second Friday, entitled "The Raj Company Ruled India and the Land of the Mughals." So we'll explore the glittering world of Maharajas and Nabobs and how the East India Company forever transformed India, how these two cultures clashed, and the extent to which India was changed forever.